What I'm talking about is war in the Indo-Pacific. For Xi Jinping to deliver the China dream, that is what he wants to do, is take control of Taiwan. And he set some deadlines for this. He's basically said to his military, prepare for war and be ready to go by 2027.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Story, Director of Law and Policy at the Institute of Public Affairs. There is an old saying, generals always prepare to fight the last war, especially if they won it. The history of that saying holds some lessons for Australia that we desperately need to learn. The Institute of Public Affairs, in collaboration with Strategic Analysis Australia, is determined to make sure our politicians do learn that lesson. The saying, generals always prepare to fight the last war, especially if they won it, is attributed to Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister during the First World War. France suffered grievously during that war. Over 1 million soldiers died in the mud and barbed wire of the trenches of the Western Front. The French were ultimately victorious, but they were determined to make sure that if the Germans ever invaded again, it would not cost them another million lives to defend their country. The solution the generals came up with was to build a line of fortifications along the border between France and Germany. It was known as the Maginot Line, named after a French war minister. It was a string of fixed fortifications made of solid concrete, armed with powerful guns. No more toiling away in the trenches. Next time, the French would be prepared. But we all know what happened next. Technology had moved on. Static defences had been surpassed by the more mobile options prevented by the invention of the internal combustion engine, such as attack aircraft, tanks, personnel carriers, mobile artillery, and trucks needed to supply an army on the move. It was the defeated Germans who learnt the lessons of mobile combined armed warfare, not the victorious French. In 1940, when the Germans attacked France again, they simply bypassed the Maginot Line, raced to the English Channel, and the French were defeated in 6 weeks. It is not only that the Maginot Line fortifications proved useless, they were also enormously expensive. So they diverted funds from the investments in more crucial new mobile weapons. And the fortifications also impacted French strategy and attitudes. They created what was known as a Maginot mindset, a defensive mentality, when mobile warfare was transferring the battlefield advantage to the aggressor. Australia in 2024 is suffering from its own Maginot mindset, stuck with old combat methods, old technology and old thinking. The Australian military is unsuited to the modern realities of war. Since the Second World War, Australia has fought a series of smaller conflicts in which the Australian role was to provide a small but capable supporting force to an international alliance. In each case, the Australian role, to varying degrees, has been extremely successful in both battlefield and political terms. Australian forces in Korea, Malaya, Borneo, Vietnam, East Timor, Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere acquitted themselves with great professionalism, upheld a proud Anzac tradition of courage and valour, and demonstrated solidarity with important alliance partners, particularly the United States. So true to form, Australia has learnt the wrong lessons from these successful wars. The Australian military is currently designed and equipped to fight these small wars of choice against technologically inferior adversaries, confident of the logistical support of a powerful ally. Australia has a small but highly trained defence force equipped with a small amount of highly capable equipment with a small stockpile of highly expensive munitions. But Australia has no ability to wage a protracted conflict against a powerful adversary. We cannot replace equipment losses. We cannot manufacture our own munitions. We have no capability of ramping up the size of our defence forces in a crisis. and we have minimal capabilities to operate independently of a powerful ally, which may be cut off from us or distracted by its own security concerns. But this is exactly what we will be required to do if there is a major war in our region, which is becoming increasingly likely. The IPA and SAA want to do something about this. That is why we've launched our Defence of Australia series. The purpose of the series is to create a blueprint for the next government for how Australia's parlous state of defence can be turned around. Rather than prepare for the last war, Australia needs to take a realistic look at the threats we face and how best we can defend ourselves against that threat. And that is what our two speakers will be doing today. Peter Jennings will lay out the threat that faces us, and Michael Shoebridge will explain what we need to do about it. Peter Jennings is a Director of Strategic Analysis Australia, providing strategic advice to several Australian and international businesses and Commonwealth agencies. He is also a columnist for the Australian newspaper and a regular media commentator. Peter was the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute between 2012 and 2022. He has worked in senior roles in the Australian Public Service, including as Chief of Staff to the Minister of Defence from 1996 to 1998, Senior Advisor for Strategic Policy to the Prime Minister between 2002 and 2003, and Deputy Secretary for Strategy in the Defence Department between 2009 and 2012. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter will present Australia's strategic outlook and the threat from China. Please welcome Peter Jennings.
So, John, thank you very much for that slightly alarming beginning to my talk. I guess what I have to say is if I've done my job properly, by the time I've finished, I will have alarmed you even more. I've got 7 or 8 points that I want to share with you about my read of the contemporary situation with China and what this means from a defence and security perspective for Australia going forward. And my start point for that is really to say that although it's me speaking, what I'm really going to present to you would be regarded as a very standard type of analysis that you would get from most of the defence establishments and the intelligence establishments of the United States, of the UK, the so-called Five Eyes countries, and indeed of people that watch Chinese military and political developments very closely. So I'm not sort of on some extreme end of interpretation. And the key point would be to begin with the judgment that we're facing a significantly greater prospect of military conflict in the Indo-Pacific by about 2027. And I'll come back to that date a little bit later. And to put this in context, you know, I've had a 30-year career for the most part in defence and defence-related activities in Canberra. I've spent a huge amount of time, particularly at the senior levels of my career, dealing with Australia's intervention in East Timor when we sent a brigade plus size force to stabilise Timor before its vote for independence in 1999. I spent even more time on our forces in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And in each of those cases, what we were doing was what people call wars of choice. You know, it was important, I believe, that we were there, but ultimately Australia did have a choice to deploy forces to Afghanistan or not. What I'm talking about is war in the Indo-Pacific, and that's a vastly different situation. It's something which does affect the Australian homeland. We don't have an exit strategy from our own reason, from our own region. And so what I'm going to be talking about is something which, if it happens, and we all must hope that it doesn't, but if it happens, it's going to involve Australia in a way that we can't escape from. So that's my headline judgment, and frankly, it's all downhill from here on in terms of what I'm going to share with you now. Let me sort of start with what I take to be the strategic objectives of China. So if you're Xi Jinping, you're in Beijing, you have a set of goals that you want to achieve for yourself and for your party and for your country. What are the objectives that Xi wants to deliver? Well, we don't have to guess. He actually expresses them in writings and speeches daily in Chinese newspapers. And the first goal is that he wants to resurrect what he calls the China dream. There's never much definition around that term, China dream, but what it really means is that he wants to restore China to a position of centrality and greatness, where other countries, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, but globally, pay deference to China's size and its dominating strategic role. And that has been his singular focus since he became General Secretary of the Communist Party in 2012. And he is deploying a number of particular objectives or particular strategies to bring that objective about. The first is that he wants to essentially push American military forces as far away from the Chinese mainland as he possibly can, to complicate America's ability to prevent China from achieving military dominance. And so China has modernized and is in the process of modernizing its armed forces to achieve that objective, to keep those American aircraft carrier battle groups out in the deep Pacific, to stop marine expeditionary forces getting close to the Chinese mainland. And to a large extent, they've actually been able to do that. When Treasurer Jim Chalmers was in Beijing a week or so ago, there was newspaper reporting saying for the first time ever, China had 3 aircraft carriers at sea. It's quite a significant development for a country that wasn't operating aircraft carriers 15 years ago. So that's goal number 1, push the Americans as far away from China as possible. Goal number 2 is to weaken the ties of alliance that China has with its key allies in the Indo-Pacific, so Japan, Australia, South Korea, Philippines is a treaty ally, so is Thailand actually. And so what we have seen over 20 years and more is a Chinese approach which is designed to weaken those relationships. You often hear of that when China engages in diplomacy with Australia by saying that alliance is a Cold War thinking. Australia should be a more independent-minded country. We should reduce our ties. We shouldn't be in AUKUS. We shouldn't be getting nuclear submarines from the United States. One shorthand way of describing it, I hope there are no New Zealanders in the audience, but they want Australia to be more like New Zealand, actually, a country which was once in an alliance, but now chooses to be more of an independent neutral. If we went in that direction, it would be a major victory for China. A third strategy is China wants to create a sense of deference amongst the countries of Southeast Asia, the countries of the Indian Ocean, and the countries of the Pacific region. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means in practical, real terms as we go along. They're the kind of headline public strategic goals that China has identified for itself. I would share with you some things which aren't necessarily in the headlines, but which I think are true nonetheless. And that is to say, firstly, Xi Jinping has a personal goal, which is to remain the paramount leader of China. He doesn't want to be deposed. He doesn't want to be shot by his colleagues, as almost happened to Stalin around the Politburo table. He doesn't want to be dragged out and hung by a lamppost, as happened to Mussolini. He wants to stay permanently in power, and for as long as his health will allow him to. And in order to achieve that goal, he wants to keep the Communist Party in power in China, because that's his meal ticket, to put it crudely. And so a great deal of what Xi does is about personal survival, and it's about party survival. And a great deal of what you've seen from his behaviour in the last 12 years of his power has been about, how do I strengthen the position of the Communist Party with regard to probably the group that China fears the most globally, and that's the Chinese people. The Communist Party fears the most. That's the Chinese people. So there's kind of an unstated political objective in terms of those of Xi Jinping's strategic aims for his time. So what's happening in the Indo-Pacific right now? Well, I've mentioned pushing back the United States. And on the face of it, I'd say so far, in terms of Chinese policy, a success. So in 2014, China began the process of occupying and militarizing a whole series of shoals and other rocks, sort of barely appearing above the surface of the waters in the South China Sea. And I was at the time actually asked by the Abbott government to be involved in the development of what became the 2016 Defence White Paper. Different Prime Minister at that stage, but and I like to say to people, well, in the time it took Australia to write its 2016 Defence White Paper, China militarised the South China Sea. They actually created 3 major air and naval bases, raising the cost of any opposing military force that might want to operate in the region. And we see that on almost a daily basis, where an Australian helicopter has flares fired at it by a Chinese aircraft, or when an Australian P8 maritime surveillance aircraft had chaff thrust at its engine intakes. These are China's way of saying, stay out of our waters. We'll make it much more difficult for you to operate in that part of the world. We've seen China continue to work on reducing its the strength of American alliances, and I'd say they're not such a successful picture. It's worked in a number of cases, most particularly something that we've not watched very carefully at all, Thailand, although it's a treaty ally, now probably closer to Beijing than Washington. I think significantly closer to Beijing than Washington. Some countries have gone in the opposite direction. Philippines, under the Marcos Jr., now closer to the US. Other countries, Japan, has kind of become much more alarmed about the growth of Chinese military power. And in fact, on the 23rd of December last year, in an announcement which almost no one will have seen in this audience, Japan announced an intent to double its defence spending from 1% of gross national product to, when you're the world's 4th largest economy, spending 2% of gross national product, that's a fairly significant development. So on balance, I'm going to call it a draw or a fail, in fact, in terms of Chinese policy. They've not really been able to undermine the alliances. But they've had a lot more success in terms of getting the countries of Southeast Asia to bend the knee, to use a colloquial term, to become more deferential towards the interests of China. And conversely, our footprint in that region is getting smaller. Our investment is becoming smaller. Our diplomatic footprint is becoming smaller. The West is sort of slowly losing Southeast Asia. One of the big areas of combat is the Pacific Islands, and we've all seen this over the last little while, including a couple of years ago with the announcement that somehow was kind of leaked out of the Australian intelligence system that the Solomon Islands was close to concluding a military access treaty with China. And you may be asking yourself, well, why does that matter? Why should we care so much about the Solomons? And my answer to that is read your Second World War history, because in a sense what you're getting is a repeat of what the strategy of the Japanese Imperial Army and Navy was, just modified with Chinese characteristics. So in 1942, after Pearl Harbor, Japan started to move its military forces down the Southeast Asian peninsula. It began to attack Papua New Guinea. It moved forces onto Bougainville and down the Melanesian archipelago to the Solomon Islands. It did that not because it was that interested in those territories. It did it to keep the Americans as far away from the Western Pacific as it possibly could. And that was an important enough a strategic objective for Japan that they were prepared to lose 40 to 50,000 people fighting in Guadalcanal. China's doing the same thing. And the risk of a Chinese military presence in the Solomon Islands, for example, is all of a sudden you have Brisbane potentially within the range of a missile that might be fired from the east of Australia. It's only 1,600 kilometres or so. And that's why China is in the South Pacific and the Central Pacific. It's complicating the capacity of the Americans to bring their military forces closer to the western part of Asia. So that's a real fight right now between us and other Western countries to work out how we can prevent that Chinese influence from sort of taking over the region. I could say more about the Indian Ocean, but it's a similar story, much further away, obviously, from China. But their big strategic objective is to make sure that they control the flow of oil and liquid natural gas coming through from the Middle East around the choke point, which is the Straits of Malacca, where Singapore comes down to just north of Indonesia. If China can control that flow to assure its own energy supplies and deny those energy supplies to Japan or Australia, that is a major tactical victory in a potential future conflict. So that's what's happening in the Indian Ocean region. Now, I want to pause just briefly to talk a little bit about an individual, the most significant political figure so far in the 21st century, Xi Jinping, in order to sort of help you understand, well, who is this guy and what does he mean? He's hardly known, I think, in terms of an Australian popular audience, but let me just mention briefly, Xi comes from sort of Communist Party royalty. His father was a general who fought with Mao, marched with Mao on the Long March, defeated the Chinese nationalists in a number of major military conflicts. And so after the 1949, when the Communist Party takes over, Xi's dad is a senior member, sort of royalty inside the Communist Party. In the late 1950s, his dad had a falling out with Chairman Mao. He disagreed with some of Mao's tougher line policies that ultimately turned into the Great Famine that killed millions and millions of Chinese peasants. And as a result of that, Xi Jinping Sr. was essentially one of the first casualties of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. He was denounced. Xi Jinping, as a 9 or 10-year-old, saw his father beaten up and humiliated on a public stage where the sort of early versions of the Red Guards, put a dunce's cap on him, hung a sign around his chest, "I'm a capitalist roader," and his dad was sent off to jail for a decade. There's rumours that Xi Jinping lost a sister, a slightly older sister at the time. And Xi Jinping was himself sent off to the countryside where he worked the fields for 10 years. The little area that he lived, it's often described as a cave, is now almost a shrine for Chinese tourists to go and visit. And there are posters up on the walls of Marx, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao. And about 1976, Xi comes back to Beijing in his early 20s. And there's a famous American cable where he's sort of being described by people who knew him at the time with someone saying, well, at a time when we were watching American cowboy movies and chasing girls, Xi was reading deeply into the literature of Marxist-Leninism. His favourite author, interestingly, Stalin. And I like to think that Xi was sort of gaining a sense of what his leadership style was going to be like. He became redder than red. And his first significant job was to be a secretary to the second general in charge of China's Central Military Commission. So he was learning about military things at that time. And then through the 80s and 90s, he sort of moves up through the ranks of Chinese Communist Party leadership. Initially, he gets a province to control in the inner part of the country. Ultimately, he is put in charge of the province which borders Taiwan. In all of those places, what he was doing was using allegations of corruption against his communist cohort leadership to get people in jail or to push people out of leadership positions. And so in 2012, when he becomes General Secretary of the Communist Party, he's learnt the skills about how you build a cadre of people to support you, which he has continued through all of the levels of government. And if you read into this, what you'll find is that every year or so, the intelligence community was the latest group. The entire leadership of the intelligence community was purged. They were all Xi Jinping picks anyway, but he put in a new group. So he's destabilising any potential within inside the party or the military or the intelligence and security apparatus to supplant him. And he's done that very effectively. As a defence official, the most senior Chinese military person I met at the time I hosted him in Canberra was a three-star general called Guo Bozhong. Guo was a tough old guy who'd, when he made his visit to Australia, it was the only second time he'd been outside of the mainland, which is one thing the PLA does. They don't like their senior generals to travel because it might weaken them. But I dealt with Guo. A couple of years later, he is denounced, stripped of his rank, prosecuted for selling senior officer military commissions, which is a way to make money in the PLA, and sent to jail. He's in jail now for the rest of his life. And he would have done that, of course, there's no question, because that's what the senior leadership of the Chinese People's Liberation Army does. But his main flaw, Guo Bozhong's main flaw, was he was a pick of Jiang Zemin, right, who was back in the day a factional opponent of Xi Jinping. So this is our boy. This is the guy who's now in charge. And I firmly believe that as he looks at his position and he looks at the world, the number one thought he has in his head is, they're not going to do to me what was done to my father back in the late 1950s or early 1960s. I'm going to keep an iron grip on control of this country for as long as I possibly can. And he's managed that very successfully. What I would say is that most of his sort of signature personal political reforms have actually turned out to be failures, though. So he's the guy that's in charge of Belt and Road, which was this idea of, we're going to build infrastructure around the Indo-Pacific and into Europe, ports and airports and railways. And the purpose of the infrastructure is to make those little countries dependent on us. And Sri Lanka is a good case in point. They built a huge port. The problem with that is that it's turned out to be a bit of a disaster. It's led a lot of bad debts in Chinese banks, which are never going to be repaid. Countries may or may not be dependent. In the case of Sri Lanka, the government that was responsible for that is now out of power. So that's a Xi Jinping reform. Another one was called China 2030, which was a strategy to try and build China's technological leads in a whole bunch of areas of science and technology research. quantum computing, stealth technology for aircraft, that type of thing. And that informed a huge effort of intellectual technology theft on the part of China's intelligence community from the West. Partially successful. So there is a Chinese aircraft called the J-20. It's a knockoff version of the F-16. It's a pretty good aircraft, not as good as, but not bad for a first try. And so there's been some success around that. Then he was the author of Wolf Warrior Diplomacy, which was the idea that China was sort of going to be rude and tough and it was going to force concessions from other governments. And in fact, that was so ineffective that it kind of led to a bit of a reversal, and we've gone back somewhat to the smiley face of Chinese diplomacy, which is why our government currently thinks they've stabilised the relationship with China. No, they haven't. It's just been a change of tone coming out of Beijing. But the biggest problem has been Xi's failure to drive the Chinese economy to produce more growth. And it used to be said that what China needed to do in order to satisfy the living aspirations of its people was grow at about 6% a year. And if you could do that every year, would look better than the year before in terms of Chinese living standard. And that has simply failed. And I think a key reason for that is it's impossible for a system as tightly controlled from the centre as China is to let business flourish, to let business innovate. And indeed, where Chinese business has done that, generally speaking, what's happened is they've been clamped down on by the party because they don't want an Alibaba, for example, to become a separate source of authority on anything as far as Chinese citizens are concerned. And so you look at the Chinese economy today, there's a whole lot of bad debt which is being carried by the banks. There's a housing crisis which is directly impacting on the pockets of Chinese people. There is broadly a sense of strategic failure. What does the Communist Party do? What does Xi Jinping do in that context? When the ideology is bankrupt, the economy is failing, demography, which I haven't mentioned, is a disaster. There are 30 million Chinese males that are never going to be able to have a partner because of the after effects of the one-child policy. What I think he thinks is you flick the switch to nationalism. And this is where we come to Taiwan. Basically, this is a play to sustain the ideological support of the Chinese people for an otherwise bankrupt government by getting them passionate about the idea that Taiwan has to be brought under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. And the party calls this reunification. I have to tell you, there has not been a day when Taiwan has been ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, not a day. There hasn't been many years in past when Taiwan has actually been ruled by mainland China, but it doesn't matter. I have never met a person from the mainland of China who's not passionately supportive of this idea that the China dream is going to be realised when we take over control of Taiwan. And so in my talk, what I've wanted to do is to try to create a sense of, right, this is the objective. And for Xi Jinping to deliver the China dream, to be the greatest leader since Mao, that is what he wants to do, is take control of Taiwan. And he set some deadlines for this. He's basically said to his military, prepare for war. That's the core line of every speech that Xi gives to the military, and be ready to go by 2027. Why 2027? 2027 is the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the People's Liberation Army. And these sorts of anniversaries don't sort of mean too much to us, but that actually means quite a lot in terms of how the Communist Party positions its thinking. And so everything the Chinese military has done is to put themselves into a position where they can do that. And the story there is there've been some significant failures, but mostly there've been successes where they built their strength, They've turned from being a mass land army designed to control the peasantry to a small high technology force designed to project power across the Straits of Taiwan. And this is where we're now at. And you will have seen when Nancy Pelosi visits, there's an exercise. China shows we can blockade the island. So basically, I think that's the plan in a sort of a last-ditch effort to control a population which is beginning to feel a bit dissatisfied with the rule of the Communist Party. They're going to flick the switch to nationalism in order to take over, attempt to take over Taiwan. So I'm just going to finish with a couple of thoughts about how that might happen and what it might look like. And there I want to say that, look, the impression is, if you read the papers, you'd think that this is going to be some sort of mass amphibious landing. And what I want to say there is that is the least likely strategy that China is going to employ. Taiwan is a very difficult target. We the Allies looked at the possibility of invading Taiwan in 1944. The Americans gave it up because they thought it was too hard. They went for Okinawa instead. That wasn't easy. But it's a difficult place to put amphibious assault vessels on. What I think China is going to attempt to do is, firstly, they will blockade the island. They will cut it off completely, both physically and in terms of IT technology. Secondly, they are going to do, in their mind, more successfully the thing that the Russians failed to do in February of 2023, the second invasion of Ukraine. So the Russian aspiration for that was, we're going to punch our forces fast through to Kiev as we possibly can. We're going to kill Zelensky and the leadership. We're going to install a puppet head. We'll declare victory. And that's really going to be the Chinese approach. They're going to go after the senior leadership of Taiwan. They'll kill the Taiwanese Air Force and Navy. They imagine, much as the Russians imagine, that there's a sort of a fifth column that's going to spontaneously rise up and support this in Taiwan. I don't think that's going to happen. And then they're going to, declare victory. That's the sort of the essence of the strategy. Michael's going to tell us all how we stop this from happening. I'll give you the headline judgment about how do we stop this from happening, and that is to say, we Australia and we the Allies and the United States need to build up a military capability as fast as we possibly can in order to create a situation of deterrence. And what I mean by that is, the number one task from a military perspective that we have each and every day for the next 5 years is to make sure that when Xi Jinping wakes up, he thinks to himself, not today. Today it's too hard. It's too complicated. There's too many allied forces out there. The Japanese Navy's too strong. Those Australians, well, they're tough boys. We don't want to go after them. That's deterrence, right? And if we can deliver that deterrent capability and we can get through to the point where Xi no longer is going to be seen as a viable leader of the PRC, I think we have a chance to sustain peace. So what Michael is going to talk about now is, well, what do we in Australia do? And here the problem is, I'm talking out to 2027, right? That's not far. The nuclear submarines, that's 15 years away. The Chinese do not care what the shape of the defence force is like in the late 2030s. So what can we do between 2025, that's when the federal election is going to be, and 2028, which is when the next election is going to be? That's the purpose of the series that we're writing with Scott and our friends at the IPA. So I think with that, Scott, I'll finish, and John, I'll go to Michael, and then we'll do questions after that. John, is that right?
Just think if everyone could thank Peter Jennings for that fantastic presentation.